Hi, I'm James Zogby and welcome to Viewpoint. Tonight we'll take a look at recent developments on the topic of immigration, including deportations, Alabama's anti-immigration law, and how the issue is going to play in presidential politics. We'll do that with Frank Sherry of America's Voice. Then I'll talk to Ahmed Maher. He's one of the founders of Egypt's April 6th youth movement, about where the movement is today and what lies ahead in post-revolutionary Egypt. But first, I want to welcome back to the show Chaz Freeman. He's chairman of Projects International, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. He was U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia during Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and a former member of the Iraq Study Group. For a decade, he served as president of the Mideast Policy Council. His most recent book is called America's Misadventures in the Middle East. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
I want to start with the news of the day, and that is the killing of Muammar Gaddafi. It was rather gruesome, the pictures that we saw. Something about the way he was killed spoke to me quite a bit about what lies ahead. Just talk to me a little about this Transitional National Council, how it is. Can it govern? Is it ready for prime time? And now that Gaddafi is gone, there's going to be focus on can they bring the country together. What do you see in store for Libya as it moves forward?
Well, I think it's a very confused picture. The savagery of Colonel Gaddafi's death is an indication of how far that country has to travel in terms of attaining civilized standards of behavior. It's a tribal society. Many people, I think, have mistaken a combination of civil and tribal warfare for a revolution. There are elements of revolution in what's been going on. But I think the government that has yet to come into being is going to have its hands full. This wasn't a country in many senses. It was cobbled together by the Italians from 3 Ottoman provinces. Colonel Gaddafi ruled it by dividing its people rather than uniting them. And now they're starting all over from a very, very low base and with a huge number of uncertainties.
Was Secretary Clinton, who was just there, congratulating them and calling it, looking forward to a free Libya, was America premature in doing this? Did they have a choice, or did they do the right thing in how they're in effect blessing this TNC? Well,
it's good politics, and the TNC, for want of anything else, is in charge. I think we're going to see elections in Libya, supposedly, in about 8 months, I guess, and we'll see what comes of that. I think the TNC is a transitional device, as its name implies.
I want to go to a story here in Washington, and that is this alleged assassination attempt on Adel Jaber. I read a piece today that said that this says more about, if the story is true, that it says more about Iran's weakness and its ineffectiveness and ineffectualness than it does about anything else. But what do you make of the story and how what its consequences are going to be? What the impact of it is?
Well, first of all, I'm very skeptical about this story. The pieces don't hold together. Here you have a down-and-out used car salesman in Texas who's doing a drug deal, apparently, with Los Zetas, a Mexican drug cartel, goes out of his way on an open telephone line and elsewhere to mention that he's fronting for the Quds Force in Iran. Why on earth would a professional agency like the Quds Force employ somebody like that? It just doesn't hold up. This is when you have a story where so many things don't add up, it really is appropriate to ask who benefits. And I think you have to, I at least have an open mind as to whether the Mujahideen al-Khalq or Mossad or someone else who's been trying to incite an attack on Iran and unite Saudi Arabia in that effort might not be behind this. In any event, it certainly stirred the pot. It's clear that the Saudis accept the story. It's clear that the administration has decided that this is an opportunity and an occasion to ratchet up the pressure and the bellicose rhetoric against Iran. And whether it's true or not, I suppose there's some risk the story might unravel at some point to the embarrassment of the administration. Whether it's true or not, they've chosen to ride with it in a big way.
Let me switch gears. I have a lot of topics I want to talk to you about tonight, and the next is Syria. The Arab League didn't rescind or suspend Syria's membership. Instead, gave it 15 days to meet with a delegation of foreign ministers to talk about ending the violence and beginning the process of negotiations leading to transition. The question is, I've had some opposition folks, members of the SNC on the show. They don't want to negotiate. I'm not quite sure the Syrian regime wants to negotiate, despite their protestations about wanting reform, etc. How successful do you expect this to be, and what would be the consequences of the Arab League coming back saying both sides said no, or this regime said yes, the opposition said no, or vice versa, and no outcome? What's going to happen next on this in terms of the inter-Arab response to Syria? Well,
we're going to see pretty soon, I think. I think the delegation's going there in a few days. We'll see pretty soon what postures are struck by the government and the rather fractured opposition. It's not quite clear that the opposition is as united as it sometimes wants to appear to be. My guess is that nobody's going to come clean about whether they really want to negotiate or not. There will be some confusion still, or ambiguity about this. And I don't expect the Arab League to do much of anything, frankly. And if they don't, then I don't think the international community is in a position to act, and events will continue to take their own course in Syria. I think the one thing that is clear is that very few people now believe that Bashar al-Assad can ever return to the effective government of his country. So we're in for a prolonged struggle in Syria, most likely.
If the Arab League suspended membership, would that have an impact? Would that have consequences?
I don't think so.
You don't? Okay.
I think the question would be whether the Arab League did what they did in the case of Libya, which is to pass the issue to the Security Council. If they did, then there would be a chance of getting Chinese and Russian support, at least abstention perhaps, for some sort of international action that is beyond what's been done. Without an Arab League move of that kind, I don't see it happening.
The Syrian opposition say they don't want that kind of intervention. It would be interesting to see how that plays out. If you want to get in the conversation out there, give us a call. If you're calling from overseas, the number is 001-202-420-5665. If you're calling from here in the U.S., the number is 1-202-420-5730. You just came back from Bahrain.
Right.
And there is now in the works an independent commission of inquiry that includes judges who were involved in Rwanda and Bosnia, etc., who are to release a report on October 30th. Mm-hmm. U.S. has held up arms sales to Bahrain pending the outcome of that report. So apparently it's going to have some weight. The question is, how serious is this commission? What do we know of it? Is it truly an independent commission?
Well, I think it's certainly portrayed that way in Bahrain. One suspects it's fairly sympathetic to the government. And I must say, after going to Bahrain, I have a bit more sympathy for the government there than I did before. The opposition apparently is negotiating ad referendum to a council of clerics in an Iranian-style version of the rule by jurists or wilayat al-faqih philosophy. It's pretty hard to reach a compromise with someone who thinks he's speaking for God.
And so the commission report comes out, are there expectations about it? Is it being anticipated at all? Are sides sort of poised in any way based on what that is, or is it simply something that is going to come, pass, and no outcome?
Well, there's a great deal of interest in it,
Okay.
and in fact, I think there are beginning to be leaks in the press, which is of course government controlled, out of the commission proceedings. So I think people are very interested in the outcome, but they don't know at this point quite what it will mean.
One last country before I come here, and that is, well, actually two. It's the Egyptian and Tunisian elections. Tunis is voting shortly. They've already started international voting, and Egypt will be in a short period of time. Article in the New York Times today, sort of projecting Ennahda as the strongest force in the country. It seems as if the U.S. is preparing itself for a Muslim Brotherhood very strong showing in Egypt. Is it time that we start to recognize that this is the outcome, this is where we're going to be, or is this premature?
Well, I don't think anybody can say what the result of an election, maybe a pollster like you could, but the rest of us can't say what the result of an election is going to be. I think the consequences of a Ennahda victory in Tunisia, in this constituent body that's to write a constitution, or similarly in Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood, a very strong showing, perhaps not an outright victory, are quite considerable. But I think this challenges us to come to grips with the reality, which is that to a great extent the democratic forces in North Africa and elsewhere in the Arab world are associated with Islamism. This is not unusual. We have a mildly Islamist party in power in Turkey, which is widely seen as a model in the region for a democracy that's respectful of religion, but not partisan with respect to it. So I think it's not a surprise that we will see, most likely, quite a dramatic increase in the role of Islamists in government across the Arab world as these elections unfold.
Let's go to Wisconsin for a call. Caller, your question. Hello?
I can't hear the question.
I'm not hearing either.
I don't know.
Do we have Wisconsin on the phone? Hello? No response from Wisconsin. I want to ask you a question about President Obama at the United Nations. The speech was not well received in the Arab world, and
it was not received on the floor. There was no applause.
Yeah, it was striking, actually. This was not Netanyahu before Congress, one might suggest. The issue is that did he do himself damage that is permanent? Is there a bounce back from this? I think the administration is probably looking, the speech was assessed at being one that looked more toward the elections than it did toward world leadership. But can you give a speech like that at the UN and come back next year or the year after with something better?
I don't think so. I think this is permanent damage to the credibility of the President and the United States on the main issue of interest, which was the absence of any kind of peace process for years between Israelis and Palestinians. Essentially, the Palestinians have decided they can't count on the United States. That speech seemed to validate that judgment.
Let's go to Texas for a call. Caller? Hello?
Hello, yes.
Yeah.
My question is, if the Western countries are sympathetic to the Syrians, how about Yemen and Bahrain?
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I think in the case of Bahrain, at least, from the outset, there was pretty widespread sympathy, particularly in March as the demonstrations began. As the demands of the demonstrators began to escalate and become more closely associated with Iranian ideology, And as concern rose over the role of Iran possibly in Bahrain, a lot of that sympathy began to attenuate. But I think generally speaking, Western countries follow the situation in Bahrain to the extent they do with an open mind and some hope that the government will be able to do what it says it wants to do, which is move toward a sort of constitutional monarchy over time. Yemen is much more confused. I don't think anybody has much sympathy for Ali Abdullah Saleh, but his opposition doesn't excite much sympathy either. And nobody seems to know what the issues are, or whether if there were, in fact, an effective change of government, if the president were, in fact, to make good on his several promises to leave, what would replace that? I don't think there's much expectation that it would be a real democracy.
Let's go to UK for a call. Caller?
Hello.
Hi. Your question?
Hi. My question to His Excellency, the Ambassador, is about the terminology of the Islamist movement. So many people actually unhappy to use that word. Especially teaching of the Quran compared with the teaching of the Old Testament. The Quran is very tolerant. But my question to the Ambassador is, so many politicians today have declared Islam is not the problem. They don't fight Islam or the Islamic world. Don't you think that if Islam is not problem, could be the solution? Thank you very much.
Well, of course, the slogan, Islam is the solution, is a very Islamist slogan. And I think the caller is absolutely correct. Historically, Islam certainly was the most tolerant of all three of the Abrahamic religions by a wide margin. There were Jewish and Christian ministers in governments in Baghdad and Damascus and in the various states that made up Muslim Spain. So there's no question of the historic role of Islam as a tolerant and open-minded religion. But that was then, and now is now. And nobody would apply the adjective tolerant to the Taliban, for example, or the whole Deobandi school of Islam in South Asia. And I'm sorry to say that much as I like Saudi Arabia, I would not characterize it as exhibiting tolerance for other faiths or even for different strains of Islam. So I think there is a problem, and I don't think it helps to deny that there is one.
Let's go to California for a call. Caller?
I agree with your guest in that the Iranian plot to assassinate an ambassador has issues and that a lot of the facets of the case just don't wash. And I wanted to know what he thought might be behind this case.
Thank you.
Well, I think there's several theories. I mean, first of all, it may very well be true. And as James Zogby suggested, it may say something about the level of incompetence in Iran. So one can't rule that out.
One never wants to judge one's enemies as stupid and bunglers, but you also don't want to overemphasize the sophistication of your enemies either.
And it doesn't make sense to demonize them.
Yeah.
But if it isn't true, and certainly the administration seems to be convinced that it is, then I think it was either a false flag operation, meaning an operation that was conducted to appear to be that of the Quds Force or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, but which was not, or it is an FBI sting gone awry. We've seen an awful lot of those, where it's very hard to decide whether we're dealing with entrapment or with some sort of very ingenious FBI uncovering of a real plot.
The guys in Miami, for example, or the guys up in New York with the missiles and the whatever. I mean, there were a lot of those that were quite shaky, and as cases go. And I was never quite sure how to fit this one into the continuum of those. But let's go to Oklahoma right now. Yeah.
Hey, how you doing today?
Good.
Yeah, listen, I have a question. I'd like to find out, since the U.S. was involved in this Gaddafi manhunt, when do you think the international community will indict George Bush?
Well, I suspect that there probably are people around the world who would like to do that, but I don't think the international community as a community is at all likely to do it. And this is one of those cases where political misbehavior receives a political punishment rather than a legal one.
Thanks for joining us and elucidating the issues as you always do. When we come back, we're going to take a look at immigration with Frank Sherry of America's Voice, and we'll take more of your calls, so stay with us.